always. I'd been raised a young Earth creationist,
Okay.
which is like a common way people read Genesis, right?
Right.
But the problem is that I was really made for science, and I was really drawn to it.
Are going to get to that, a really important question, but I want you to kind of sketch out from your perspective, what was your view of Adam and Eve and how they fit with the scientific paradigm before you started to research for your book?
Oh, well, I'd always been, well, I mean, let's put it this way, not always. I'd been raised a young Earth creationist,
Okay.
which is like a common way people read Genesis, right?
Right.
But the problem is that I was really made for science, and I was really drawn to it. And from a really young age, I was just get exposed to it, and I just really sensed and felt that conflict. And it was a real point of difficulty for me. But as I learned more about science and got to see the evidence for myself, and also learn more about Scripture, and actually read Genesis for myself rather than relying on what people told me it said, actually looking at what it actually said, I started to move to a position much more in line with mainstream science. And I just found myself to be a profound skeptic of the conflict. I just couldn't understand why it was people thought there was a conflict. I mean, I had some big questions in my mind about some precise scientific details, but the reasons why people said there was a conflict didn't actually match what I knew about science. And they were saying, well, science tells us X, but I'm like, but no, actually that's not actually what mainstream science shows. And when I started researching my book, well, I mean, I started researching the book before I realized I was going to be writing a book. It was just a response to a book by a then colleague of mine who had really made an argument against Adam and Eve. And I read the book and I said, man, the science on this is just really not correct. And so I was writing a review of it and looking into that more closely. And that just really ended up really kicking a hornet's nest, because it turns out that my skepticism back then in 2017 and before was not well appreciated by others. Everyone else thought it was a solved problem, that there was a fundamental conflict, and that's just been certain.
Right.
And my skepticism was just so profoundly confusing to people. I ended up being boxed into writing this book.
Well, let me just say that it's a fascinating book. It's an amazing read. I remember my wife is a physician's assistant, so she's also in the medical field. And as I was listening to your book and kind of grappling with some of the points, I explained what your general thesis of the book was. And she was like, hold on, wait a second. And she started asking me a series of questions, and I'm like, babe, you got to read the book. It's really good. So can you, so I'm encouraging people ultimately to read the book, but can you just briefly kind of sketch out your thesis there, your general idea in the book?
Yeah, well, the basic idea is that maybe the traditional readings of Genesis, which I'll define in just a moment, are entirely consistent with, happening in the same physical reality with what we find in science. It's just that they're different, describing that same physical reality in different ways. And not to be very specific, I mean, because some people will say things like that and then go on and take a very figurative view of Adam and Eve. That's not what I'm talking about.
Right.
I'm talking about Adam and Eve, just as recent as 6,000 years ago, though you could have them more ancient if you want.
Right.
Ancestors of all of us, and also de novo created, meaning without parents. So without parents, okay? And if you'll notice, that's how most people have read Genesis through most of history.
Right.
In that sense, it's traditional, and also it's beyond just that. Many aspects of that, though not all of it, have made its way into core confessions across the church. Core one there is ancestors of us all. That's not explicitly stated in Genesis, but that comes from trying to put together coherent theology, including the New Testament, particularly Romans and 1 Corinthians and Acts. Mm-hmm. And just most of the church has really understood Adam and Eve that way. Now, what you'll notice is that there's silence about a really critical fact that's necessary to assess this scientifically. There's silence in the traditional account. There's a question mark. There's a mystery about whether or not there were people outside the garden. It turns out for thousands of years, it's part of the Genesis tradition to wonder about Cain's wife, to wonder about people outside the garden. And so my crazy idea is that maybe that account is entirely consistent with evolutionary science. And I'm not doing anything funny here. There's no pseudoscience involved. Actually, the science in my book ends up getting endorsed by Nathaniel Lentz. Even though evolutionary creationists completely disagree with this approach, they have finally conceded that actually the science is correct in it. And they're reassessing how to approach this. And it's to that point where, even people who disagree with it on theological grounds, like Jerry Coyne,
right,
and others, will concede, well, the science here is really good. It just turns out that our best estimates say that, if there was, for any couple living in the Middle East about 6,000 years ago, our best estimates show that they would be ancestors of everyone before, Jesus walked the earth.